So I'm going to give each of the speakers a chance to introduce themselves before they give their first speech. And the topic today is resolved. Binghamton University should engage in the deer cull on campus. So on the proposition side, we're going to have Joe and and then we're going to have Mateo and Julian. Again, I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And on the opposition side, we'll have Joe and I.
Okay, so I'm Julian Shepard. I'm a professor of biology here. I teach courses in a bunch of things. Entomology, ornithology, conservation biology, and several others too. So what I intend to do in my 9 minutes is to sort of outline just some of the facts about the deer history here and what they're doing to our nature preserve and what we can possibly do about that. Deer were a part, of course, of the natural environment here. By the way, are you all hearing me? Good. They're part of the natural environment, and they were presumably reasonably abundant through sort of the times of the indigenous peoples here, or they definitely used them. During the sort of 1700s and 1800s, though, this became widely settled by subsistence farmers moving in from Europe largely, and they, for the first time, really cleared the forests here. Instituted a lot of agriculture, and in the process, of course, culled the deer pretty heavily. In fact, to the point that the deer were actually very rare in about 1900 or so. About that time, people started instituting game laws and putting in hunting seasons. The deer began to recover. At the same time, by the way, their predators had been eliminated. Cougars and wolves are the primary predators of deer. They had been eliminated, shot out. They were no closer than sort of the distant reaches of Canada. So, so there were no predators left. There were enough deer left that they began to reproduce, and they got a fairly high reproductive rate, and they began to reproduce. And even by 1950, they were not terribly abundant, but after 1950, they increased in abundance. Until in the 1980s, they were very abundant, and they've been increasing in abundance. Their impacts are kind of shown in this slide up here, taken from up in our woods, just about a quarter of a mile away, College in the Woods. And what you can see here is, I have got a pointer, sorry, but you can see let's see if one of these works. Okay. Anyway, what you can see is you can see the forest floor, you can see the trees there, and what you can do is you can see right through between the trees and the forest floor to a height of about 5 feet, and it's completely empty there. That's what we call a browse line. The deer have basically emptied everything out in that 5 feet. In the process, they chew all of the sprouts in the forest. They chew all of the sort of herby things like spring wildflowers that occur. We've actually documented the loss of a dozen species of these kind of spring wildflowers that are very common in the forests or used to be around here. There's the only saplings left in CIW woods are actually some scraggly looking beech saplings, and maybe I'll show you a picture of that. One here. This is a little beech sapling that I call a bashed beech, because what you can perhaps see is that this is kind of gnawed and nibbled by the deer, keeps putting out a few more leaves each year, but these are pretty much the only things that are left in the college in the woods, and other woods on campus. Some of the woods up on the slopes are a little less impacted, but that's the impact of the beech. The impact is not only sort of on forest trees, and incidentally, what it means, the damage to the forest trees means that we don't see any regeneration in approximately the last 20 years. We don't see any new forest trees coming in. So think about what that means for the forest in another 50 years or so. It also means that it impacts all sorts of other parts of that environment. We've actually documented the loss of ground nesting birds. There's only really one ground nesting bird left on the lower campus, and that's, for various reasons, is a little more secure. And it isn't that the deer eat the birds. What they do is they remove the underbrush, removes their cover, and allows predators to see them very easily. And so the impact of deer grazing is very widespread on all parts of the ecology. Basically, we reckon that our nature preserve has been badly impacted, and that we feel that this is due to our human history, and that therefore we have some responsibility to actually see what we can do to ameliorate the problem. The problem is not just kind of our aesthetic appreciation of the environment, although that's a big deal, but it's also the we use the nature preserve a lot for education, for research, and it's not a whole environment, it's just a partial environment. There are human problems sort of associated with our loss of this environment, such as the Lyme disease, which is, of course, the adult deer are the hosts for the adult ticks, so the presence of deer definitely enhances the presence of ticks and therefore Lyme disease. The incidence of Lyme disease we actually know on campus. It's up around 30 to 40% in the ticks, so it's a distinct hazard. The ticks didn't used to be here until 5 years ago. Actually, I wondered why they never invaded, but they finally did, and they're blooming in large numbers now. There is also the sort of horticultural damage that the deer do. We've got lots of neighbors complaining. One complained, oh, that I've lost, I planted $1,000 worth of cedars, which is actually pretty crazy to plant if there are deer around, because deer love cedars. But you know, there's substantial loss there. It's a difficult problem keeping things going on campus because the deer range onto the campus every night and chew down. I saw fresh tracks just on the other side of this building today, actually. They do seem to use our woods as a dormitory, and then they commute at night, of course, out into the surrounding neighboring areas and chew their way through the neighborhood. You might say, well, doesn't that leave the nature preserve unimpacted? No, because they browse there first. If there's anything there, they will take that first. And then there's the car collision damage, which the head of chief of police here said a couple of years ago that he regretted losing, sort of having to pay $3,000 for one of his vehicles, which would hit a deer. And then there's the health of the deer. When the deer get overpopulated, they get disease, they get weak, and they starve too. So we do care about that. Here's actually, I did write an outline of these things here. So these are some of the issues that I just brought up here. Just to measure sort of what the deer are doing, we actually did construct a couple of exclosures. These were several, actually. This one was actually built about 6 years ago. What you can perhaps see is that outside the exclosure, the forest floor is, first of all, you see the browse line again, but you can see the forest floor has very little green on it, and most of that green is little beech saplings. Inside it is actually a big proliferation of Canada mayflowers, which is one of these spring wildflowers that we had lost mostly in many parts of the nature preserve. And this came back very strongly. Actually, the next year they all bloomed. It's one of these things that only blooms every several years. Okay, just an outline of what we considered as control measures. First of all, everyone says, oh, well, can't you just sterilize the deer? First of all, it doesn't really work. It's very hard to get a significant percentage of the deer sterilized. It's also very expensive. You've got to employ a vet, you've got to anesthetize the deer, which traumatizes them. And then you're actually left with the deer. You know, they're not reproducing maybe, but you've still got them chewing away. So it certainly doesn't eliminate the problem very quickly. Capture and land translocation is often offered as an option. Capture means that you anesthetize them, you attempt to transport them somewhere else and release them somewhere else. Turns out, surprisingly, the deer are very sensitive to capture and translocation, and many of them die in the process. And when they're released, another cohort of them die. And of course, the real problem is that this problem of overpopulation of deer is universal around here. And so, where do you translocate them to? The state won't take them, thank you, and who will? Fencing is often suggested. Fencing, first place, is pretty expensive, not out of the realm of possibility, but pretty expensive. But then you're sort of reconstructing the habitat. You're keeping, first of all, you got to get the deer out when you build your fence. That's not a trivial problem. Secondly, you have to monitor the fence. Trees are falling all the time. We've got a nice old parts of our woods that has old trees in them which will be falling. It also sort of excludes deer. We actually don't want to exclude deer. We want to just reduce their numbers to a reasonable level. And then it potentially excludes a lot of other things too. That, frankly, we'd like to see roaming, like coyotes, foxes, things like that. Hunting season is often suggested. I won't go into that in detail. You know, people will always advance say, well, can't we do it this way, that way? Basically, no hunting season. First place, it's going to close off the nature preserve for a significant amount of time, especially during the time when a lot of people are using it. But also the problem is just, it's usually incomplete. The actual, first of all, hunters like to do bucks, and you have to really persuade them to shoot does. Secondly, there's limits. You're not supposed to be within 1,000 feet of a building in the town of Vestal, so that's a limit. So basically, and I might add that we're not novel in wanting to sort of control the deer. Lots of other organizations have attempted to control deer, universities, gardens, you know, large gardens and so forth. And none of them have found that a hunting season really works. So the last option we come to is culling. That does mean killing the deer. It can be done very humanely. The way you bring in professional sharpshooters who come to a baited area of deer, you actually bait them for several weeks ahead of time. They shoot at night. They shoot from platforms, tree stands, so that they can shoot down. They're very accurate, and they can be if the deer are sort of clustered at a bait site. They shoot the deer in the brain, so it's instant death. It's not a question of herding them into nets or anything like that. They're largely unaware, and apparently the deer are largely unaware that their neighbor is dropped too, so they can drop a bunch. It only takes a couple of sittings, a couple of nights to do the job. And what it will do is it'll bring the levels down quickly to the kind of levels that we want, namely about 10% of the present, 5 to 10% of the present population of deer. And I didn't actually say so, but the overpopulation of deer is about 10 to 20 times what is sustainable in this environment. And it's all because there is not any higher level predators to take them out. So, this is a biologist's view of it. And by the way, I have lots of colleagues here, Dick Andrews, John Titus, Dylan Horvath, and many others who have worked on this issue. And we all think this is the way to do it. We're not just savage scientists. We actually are all in this profession because we love nature and get out there as much as possible. So, so this is our solution for, and I might just add that one thing that people will bring up is say, well, you cull the deer, they're just going to come back. Yeah, they will. But maybe we can use some of these other techniques then, less drastic techniques to keep them down at a low population level. But we do think that culling is necessary right now. Thank you.
I'm a junior. I'm a member of the debate team. I'm part of the EVOS program on campus. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Shepard, who's a legend in the lab department.
Can you speak up a bit?
Sure, sorry.
Thank you.
So the first question I have is, what's the purpose of the nature preserve?
Oh, you're addressing me? Sure. What's the purpose of the nature preserve? Education, research, and aesthetic appreciation.
Okay. Are there historical examples, either in the area or at this university, of projects like this one?
Not right here, but as near as Ithaca, Rochester, Vassar College, Princeton.
Were they shown to be, what was the follow-up?
Those all employ different techniques. Vassar actually was probably the most successful as far as I know, and they did succeed with the cull. But then they had a second one, just recent year.
So, focusing on the deer, what do we know about the intelligence of the deer, or family structure, or their emotion, or what do we know about the mind of the deer?
We do know some things. We know their behavior. The deer that live in our woods down here are largely doe herds, for instance, does with their young of several years past. The bucks tend to emigrate to. The does are the doe herds are relatively sedentary. They sort of have a territory, and if a doe herd is removed or leaves a particular area, that area does remain vacant for a little while until others invade. Does that help?
Yeah. And there are family bonds?
Yes.
Okay. The causes for a lot of the ecological impacts we're talking about, could they be viewed as rooted in human presence in the area?
Yes.
Okay. And you described a whole environment.
Mm-hmm.
What would constitute a whole environment if the one here is not?
Yeah, bringing back a lot of these. First of all, reconstituting the forest. It really should have saplings growing in it, and to reconstitute the forest in the future. Secondly, there's all the other animals and plants that have disappeared.
Okay. And that's all I have.
Good.
My name is Joe Leesenshop. I'm going to be representing the opposing point of view. I'm a faculty member of the English department here, and I'm representing the Critical Animal Studies conference that's ongoing. For those people who are here for the conference, I really recommend checking out the Nature Preserve. It's a beautiful area, and they do a great job. So I'd say check that out. All right, so a couple of things. My first argument for why deer calls should not happen on campus is that it simply doesn't work. Julian's example of Vassar College shows that the deer call had to be repeated again and theoretically again in the future. And he also admits in cross-examination that deers have families that they're connected to their young, which means that you're going to have to shoot the mothers and the daughters and the sons time and time again. These are reasons for why we shouldn't just engage in senseless killing, even if there's an ecological reason, because there's an ethical imperative to preserve a sanctity of life. Now, a couple of empirical examples. Long Island spent $250,000 hiring sharpshooters to kill deer. They promised that they would kill 3,000. After a 6-month period, they killed only 192. That means you would have to bait the deer in order to trick them to come into an enclosed area in order to then gun them down with military-grade shooters. I don't think the militarization of campus and the politics is a good idea. Second, populations rebound. Delilah Williams, who's an environmental and political journalist, writes, "One reason that culling is ineffective is that deer also have the biological ability to regenerate themselves under hunted conditions, meaning doe will often attempt to reproduce in numbers equivalent to the community death toll. The same things happen with other species as well." This shows that time and time again, when we just kill deer, they come back because deer reproduce to food availability. If we eliminate the population, more food comes available, which means more deer will come in, and the deer will reproduce in order to be able to take place. In addition, Nicholas Reed, author of a book on urban wildlife, says that the culling problem of populations of animals in city landscapes is generally an ineffective practice that makes irritating situations worse while granting governments the appearance of doing something. The fact that we think we're doing something, but we have to continuously repeat it again and again, shows it's not an effective solution. Deer move into towns because it's safer. They come here because we've taken away their natural habitat. We took away their territory, their food, and their safety while providing a safe haven in places like Campus Nature Preserve. I wish people would recognize that this is our doing, not the animals. I don't think the deer should have to pay the price for our problems. There's exhaustive science which shows that deer calls of problem animals simply don't work. They return almost immediately. With deer over time, the populations simply go back. Studies going back to 1951 have repeatedly found that urban deer populations per capita reproduction is density dependent. So as a population decreases by slaughter, the number of fawns born and reared to maturity increases in inverse proportions to deer calls. The best way to stabilize urban wildlife populations might be to allow them to find a natural balance. So, to a large part, the solution to this problem is the status quo. Yes, some deer will starve to death. Yes, there'll be some ecological effect of it as a result, but the deer will plateau their populations and will stop the reproduction as a result. Now, they'll say that the university has an obligation to try and preserve the nature preserve and make sure that the campus populations are safe. Well, in 1986, the university thought that the beavers in the campus nature preserve were a threat because of the damming of the water and that it would flood various different areas. This comes from Binghamton University's webpage. So in 1986, the university had the beavers exterminated and the pond destroyed for fear of damage due to excess water flow. It might cost us a little bit too much money. And the university determined that it was not safe for the beavers to be present because they would hurt other species that would walk there. Well, Associate Professor Stepanatis, I might have pronounced it wrong, found that much of the data used by the university was either incorrect or much too high in favoring the decisions made. Stepanatis explained that the beavers created a far more attractive habitat for wetland species. However, after they were killed and exterminated on campus, they moved back within the next year and have been working on the dams ever since. The wetland area is one of the main causes for the existence of the nature preserve. If it was not for the beavers being there, there would not be a nature preserve because time and time again, the administration has tried to encroach upon the nature preserve to add more dormitories. Things like wetlands and things like deer populations stop the campus from continuing to expand upon these natural habitats, which means that even if the deer might hurt the nature preserve, it is worse to allow the universities to build buildings in those areas. Having animals in those areas stop the university from continuing to encroach on that natural habitat as well. Now, my second argument is the ethics of it. Well, deers are sentient, plants and cars are not. So I feel bad that the police chief had to spend $3,000 to be able to replace the car. That car is not sentient and the police chief is still alive. Whereas the deer that was hit by the car is probably dead, as is, as proposed, what they want, 90% of the deer population. These are populations that are known to be, as Julian puts it, very sensitive. They're able to know when they're relocated. They're able to have family relationships and connections like that. They're able to learn, and they have memories, and oftentimes return. Doe are connected with their young. They stay with them for a long period of time. To say that it's traumatizing to move them or traumatizing them to put them to sleep, and so the alternative should be to kill them, is, in my mind, a contradiction of terms, because if they are intelligent enough to be able to experience trauma, we should recognize that their intelligence to be able to have a right to live. There is a value in the individual, not just in terms of the species, which means it's not just a question of ecological preservation, because historically, while humans have tried to manage the environment and have done so sometimes successfully, there's other times where it's gone astray. And to believe that we know the outcomes of situations and how we can control it ends up being a fallacy. And we should use a precautionary principle and not try and exterminate individuals and not try and kill individuals just because we think it might have a better ecological effect on the world. Because if we do that, that allows for things like environmental fascism to be able to take place. If we think the environment is more important than the individual, there's nothing to stop restricting human consumption because we think that humans are consuming too much in various different areas. Or there's nothing to be able to stop the government from saying that this is how we have to be able to interact in the world. Which means that we should have prioritization for individual and autonomous, the individual rights of the deer, and not necessarily the rights of a species or the ecology. Because again, plants are not sentient. So what are the alternatives? First, as mentioned before, the status quo. The deer will eventually regulate their own populations. If we think that it is bad that deer are suffering, the answer should not be to kill the deer. The answer should be able to try and create situations that alleviate their suffering without having to murder them. Or, simultaneously, allow for other mechanisms to be able to come into existence. Professor Shepard mentions the question of fencing. The problem with that, he says, is that it's too expensive. Long Island wasted $250,000 for a deer call that didn't work to bring shooters into an area to kill individuals that didn't actually even result in the end goal. The university should not be spending their money in that way, especially when 5-10 years from now, they're going to have to do it again, and then another, and then again. Which means that even if the fencing is expensive, it's better to put up the fencing in order and maintain that fencing, even if there's a one-time cost and then repair cost, because that'll actually be cheaper in the long run. Third, the third option that we can use is non-lethal methods that he talks about. Karen Lang writes that after decades of research, scientists have actually readily created new non-lethal methods, such as surgical sterilization, vaccine contraception, such as PZP is another one, and they're already being offered in communities within eastern Long Island. Long Island had more success with capturing deer and anesthetizing them and making it so they couldn't reproduce than they did by culling the deer, which means that there is more empirical evidence showing in favor of those sort of alternative mechanisms, even if they happen to be expensive. Now, this is important because I would rather have trauma than be dead, right? If you're dead, the deer cannot come back or even experience that trauma, so to have a little bit of trauma is better than that. And also, the killing isn't humane. Despite what these sharpshooters claim, they are not as accurate as they claim to be. They very often miss their mark and deer slowly bleed out. And even if that only happens to 2 or 3 or 4 deer, each individual that has to slowly suffer next to their children or next to their family members, that is something that should be understood as morally reprehensible. But the other option that we have is the introduction of predators. As stated by Dr. Shepard, is a lot of the situation that caused the deer population to explode here is the way that humans have managed the environment in problematic ways that have caused it to fail. If we reintroduce predators, we could recreate that total ecology where there's natural ways for the deer to be able to regulate, where the deer population is regulated, opposed to having militarized sharpshooters come on campus at night, sit on platforms in the area where you herd deer in, and then shoot them indiscriminately until we end up with only 10% of the population left. If you did this with any population that was considered sentient or intelligent with family connections, there would be words like genocide for everyone. These are not things that we should do just because deer happen to be not as intelligent as humans. Thank you. I think it's
Oh, okay. You sort of analogize culling to militarism. I think that's a vast extension of the term of militarism. It's actually just a small cadre of sharpshooters who, by the way, are very accurate. And they can be because they're close to the deer, they're experts, and they're experienced in it, so they are rather accurate. Just about the nature preserve. It was actually established well before there was any beaver or deer. It was established for different reasons. So And I think it's been maintained because of nature, not because of deer or beavers. I would just repeat that you mentioned these ideas of of non-lethal methods. I would just repeat that they just haven't worked to significantly cull deer populations, that's all. They can get them down 30%, 40%, but we need a 90% reduction. The last thing I'd just say is that, yes, I did admit that we will need to do continuous control of populations, but I did say that it might not necessarily be a cull the second time. Vassar did a second cull. I really don't know the details of just what happened there.
Do you have any empirical examples of where a deer call 90% of the population has worked and has not had to have repeat calls?
No, I don't. Do we open this up to the audience at any point?
Yeah, at the end of, after we all do the speech, then we
Because
open
they
it.
will have some problem with all.
Oh, yeah, so yeah, this is just a cross-examination period for us, and then we have.
So that's all I have at the moment.
Thank you.
So to quickly introduce myself, my name is Mineo Chowdhury, and I am a debater for the Binghamton University Speech and Debate team. Been debating varsity debate for the last 4 years. I major in accounting, but through debate have gotten a lot of experience discussing a whole bunch of other topics. I like to sort of debate about things regarding social justice, environmental justice. So looking forward to have a nice discussion with you all. So I'd like to start by talking a little bit about what is the objective of the deer cull, right? So coming from the deer management plan that was put out by BU, the objective is to manage deer at population levels which allow maintenance of the full ecological integrity of the natural habitats at BU while maximizing public safety and minimizing the suffering of deer. Now, for evaluating the question of ethics for these kinds of things, we first need to establish a framework for how to take into account these ethical considerations. The only appropriate ethical framework is one of consequentialism, I believe. Hear me out on this. Imagine the following scenario. The brakes on a train have failed, on a speeding train have failed, and it's on a path where 5 individuals are tied to the tracks. It's impossible to stop the train, but there is a fork in the road where we can pull a lever to bring the train onto that track. Now, on that track, there is a single individual tied to the tracks. It feels wrong, it feels horrible to pull that lever, knowing that pulling that lever will have the direct effect on that individual's life to end his or her life. But at the same time, to fail to pull the lever would be even more tragic. Now, it's through this type of framework that I think that we need to evaluate questions like the deer cull because of the effects that it has on the greater ecological system of the nature preserve, the way that other animals are affected, the way that plant life is affected by the deer. And while it feels wrong to directly end the lives of the deer, it's even more wrong to let the damage that's done by the deer upon the environment go unchecked. Now, to quote Owen Harries in Power and Civilization, in politics, it is the ethics of responsibility rather than the ethic of absolute ends that is appropriate. While an individual is free to treat rights as absolute, to be observed whatever the cost, governments must always weigh consequences and the competing claims of other ends. Now, in this case, the competing concerns would be the concerns of the life of the deer versus the rest of the nature preserve. So, when considering these kinds of questions, we need to consider what are the end consequences. Now, one of the issues that gets brought up is the idea that it simply doesn't work. However, there's ways that this can be addressed, which is through
careful planning of how these culls happen, right? There always tends to be an issue of bureaucracy that gets in the way, things like these debates where people will use sort of arguments that aren't directly responsive to tear apart the idea of doing a deer cull without considering the way that we can first start with a cull and then use other methods. What happens in cases like Vassar is bureaucracy getting in the way of them implementing continuous programs where we can take in other strategies to use after the cull and instead resulted in a situation where a second cull is necessary. I think we'd be able to avoid that by taking an approach that recognizes, yes, the cull won't solve everything, but it's the first necessary step in order to be able to create change. Now, this argument of militarization, I think, is somewhat problematic. These aren't military assassins that we're bringing in, rather experts on dealing with controlling the population of deer. It isn't sort of militarization of the campus as it's been described. Also, the comparison to the controlling of the beavers, I think, is also not entirely accurate because the motivations were different. The beavers was a concern simply of the economic effects upon campus, whereas in the case of the deer cull, this is our own biology department specifically taking into account the issues of the nature preserve in order to be able to have the nature preserve's ecology actually function the way it should. The deer cull is necessary. Next, to talk about some of these alternative mechanisms. It's not that these other mechanisms don't do anything. They obviously can do something, but alone they wouldn't be effective. Now keep in mind that right now the population of the deer is 10 times greater than what it should be. In order for us to be able to actually deal with this, we need to have a solution that would be able to reduce the population of the deer by something like 90%. Something like sterilization would only be able to get 30 to 40%. Now, this is especially important when we consider the ethics of how the individual deer experience these things, right? In the status quo, the deer are starving to death. This type of starvation and the other ways in which that they are affected by overpopulation, it's morally reprehensible to say that this can go on. When Joe says, yes, the deer will starve, but it's better to starve or whatever, this is something where it still ends in their death. Their death becomes inevitable, but they suffer for weeks, for a month, whatever it is, with their families, while their families stand by and watch as they starve to death. I think that it's better to have a more humane way of dealing with it, which sharpshooting allows for the immediate death rather than slow, prolonged, painful death. And I'm looking for questions.
All right, so you say consequentialism is preferred framework. Is consequentialism always the most ethical framework to utilize?
I don't think it always is, but I think when it comes to questions of policy, it's the best way for us to come to policy in animal life as individuals, the most individuals to the most utility.
So policymakers should always use a consequential framework to help the greater good.
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay. Now, how can you ensure that these policymakers aren't going to get caught up in future bureaucratic problems like happened in Vassar?
Sorry, what was that?
How are you going to ensure that these policymakers that are going to use consequentialism aren't going to get caught up in the bureaucratic problems that you say is what causes?
Right, so I would advocate for a type of consequentialism that includes environmental concerns, the concerns of animal life as part of the consequences. Obviously, that would require convincing those who are in power to care about these issues, which is what I hope these kinds of discussions can do. But that if we can convince the greater public to care about the environment, care about animal life, then we can have a frame of evaluation for consequences that would consider things like saving the nature reserve.
How are you going to get populations to care about deer if they're being blamed as the vector of disease and the destruction of the environment and just generally a aberrant population that's shut down the way?
Well, the thing is, that's not our argument. The argument isn't that the deer population needs to be entirely eliminated. In fact, that would probably also have its own effects on the environment that would be problematic. It's simply that humans, to begin with, are the reason why we're having this deer population problem. According to the report that was put out on deer management, it was because of the white-tailed deer populations that exist here are mostly a product of past land use practices, and so we first need to deal with what we as a species, human beings, have caused to the environment before we can then also come to a better type of relationship to the environment.
Okay, and my last question is, Where do these sharpshooters get their training from?
I actually don't have an answer to that, and I do think that it's a concern that should be considered, that if we could put into place, if we had the approval to put into place something like this, that yes, we would want to research different choices of who we would bring in, and bring in those who could deal with this in the most ethical way. I think we probably might be able to find examples of sharpshooters who don't do things right, and I do agree that we need to avoid sort of recklessly going about this, but I don't think that's a reason why a deer cull in the abstract is a bad idea.
So, are you aware that in Long Island it was ex-military people who were the sharpshooters because they were able to show that they were the most accurate?
Right. Well, that's where sort of there's the balance of, I would say that probably better to have those who are familiar with the deer populations, and that specifically would be the best way to go about it, rather than those who are experts in killing humans but not necessarily how to deal with it.
Thank you.
All too often, the deer cull discussion is focused on material analysis, that focuses on statistics, a quantified approach of measuring impacts on the environment without stepping back and understanding the context. This debate particularly has become, will this work? You know, will there be gain or loss of floral diversity? What new population dynamics will happen? But the way we understand those changes are subjective and worth thinking about. So while there are objective impacts of these various ideas and ways of moving forward, it's important for us to recognize that we need to think about what is the meaning of the loss of diversity or the gain of diversity or the changes that we're trying to create in the environment. Ultimately, this is a debate about environmental intervention, our protection of our world, a defense of nature. And this is mostly motivated by what we understand nature to be. Dr. Shepard expressed a love for nature across the biology department, but that could mean different things to different people, and understanding how we understand nature is key to understanding what this deer cull is as we seek to protect it. Author Tim Ingold examined a non-Western perspective on what nature is, through what he calls ontology of dwelling. To quote him, non-Western societies with this ideal recognize that the relationship between humans and their environments are not confined to a domain of nature separate from and given independently of the domain in which they live their lives as persons. The fact that we have a nature preserve with boundaries and lines of this is nature and this is where we live on campus is kind of an example of what the major problem here might be, in that we're separating ourselves from what this environment is. And this kind of extends itself to deer, which are a part of that fluid nature. How we interact with them is dependent on how we think of nature, and what are we inside nature or outside nature. And expanding on the ontology of dwelling and how it relates to other organisms. Human persons are not set over and against material context of inert nature, where one species of person and a network of reciprocating persons. We create relationships with the deer and recognize that the deer are sharing the same nature that we live in. And what we call, these impacts we cause, are not separate from what inherently is nature. We were talking, the last speech mentioned an ecological integrity, as if there's some ideal way things should be, but we have to question whether that exists at all. That's not to say we can't hunt. In these non-Western cultures, it would be understood as a rearranging of nature if I were to go out and kill a deer, and the deer population would change. This rearranging of nature is just what the deer are doing when they eat as much shrubs as they need to survive. However, a deer cull is not a means to an ends of survival. It is the ends. The deer cull is for the sake of rearranging nature. That's our stated goal, is to restore some conception of nature that we have. And the Western alternative to dwelling, which I think is core to the deer cull proposal, is construction.
It's an external relationship, one that emphasizes the otherness of nature, an attempt to mold, control, and overpower it. And that's essential to this idea. And another author, Peter Steeves, expounds the significance of this constructionism that is core to the deer cull. This is in reference to an overpopulation of rabbits and goats on an island. It's not clear what is meant by the natural state of Round Island. The claim that rabbits and goats have ruined the island, more foundationally, is a suggestion that rabbits and goats brought by human beings have ruined the island. What makes the island unnatural is the activity of human beings. Such thinking is dangerous and misdirected. The environmentalist who calls for the return to a state untouched by human hands is separating human beings from nature, and this is the same mentality that motivates those who destroy nature. Both speeches have mentioned that the root cause of this issue is human involvement in this area. So by saying the deer are the problem here, we are also acknowledging we are part of what caused that problem, and saying now we have to fix this new dynamic. Combining Steve's idea with Dwelling's respect for the personhood of other elements in nature creates a connection between us and the deer. Evolution, I've taken a bunch of evolution classes. I took one with Matt Parker, who's here, awesome class 351. Evolution is dynamic, it's unpredictable. Earth almost once had no oxygen. And imagine if we said we had to keep the oxygen levels low. All life as we know it couldn't have existed. So I think the core here is to stop pursuing an ideal and to accept the nature that we have, accept the beauty of the CIW browse line. We said that the purpose of the nature preserve was to, for education and aesthetic. We can learn from the dynamics here without just killing the deer. So in closing, I think we have to understand the status quo as nature. Our relationship to the deer there are natural. And instead of trying to control them by killing them in what is ultimately violent, we should accept them and recognize that that is nature today and what we are a part of.
May I ask questions?
So you talk a lot about sort of this idea of like we separate ourselves from nature, but at the same time, it almost feels like you have a slightly romanticized view of nature. You do acknowledge that that killing of other beings is something that happens in nature. So I guess my first question is, in that case, would you say that things like the hunting that we did do previously were acceptable?
Well, the rearrangement of nature was a means to the end of just living. This rearrangement is just the end. So if you're going to kill and you're killing so that you can eat, that has a whole
But
different
what if
meaning.
our concern is still other individuals? Like I feel like the ends can still be like a concern for other animal life or other plant life.
How do we determine which we're going to protect? Like that becomes very, what are really our motives there?
Well, let's say even if our motives are something just like the aesthetics of the nature preserve, right? But that's something that still has value to us culturally, value to us in terms of our own happiness or whatever. So would that not be sort of an ends that we are working towards, which is our enjoyment or whatever, but sort of at the same time just rearranging nature, as you say?
But seeing nature as something that we should proactively rearrange goes against this whole idea that we need to stop thinking about nature at all, that we exist within it, and we shouldn't try to edit our surroundings.
Can you explain to me why? I guess maybe I don't fully understand.
Why what?
Like why is it that trying to sort of affect our surroundings is problematic?
Because it's motivated by an ideal that doesn't exist, particularly in the context of environmental activism, because that's what this is about. In an abstract sense, can we build a house bigger than the house we need? That's a different discussion. We're talking about killing deer in the preserve to create ecological integrity, to use your own words. So I'm analyzing that ecological integrity you're talking about.
Okay. So actually going back to my first question, I kind of do want a sort of straight answer to this. So if doing things as per nature is sort of the best thing to surviving and rearranging nature is okay, then is it okay for us to, was it okay for us to go in and hunt the deer for food?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we were to go about doing something like that now,
Yeah, I mean, the whole perspective I was bringing is not that we can't kill deer in the preserve. Under certain circumstances, should we approach it in a healthy manner, it would be reasonable. But this specific way of systematically doing it to, restore a certain order is not justifiable.
okay, thank you.
So I'll be giving a quick closing speech, and then Dr. Julian Shepard will be giving the final speech. I'll start by saying the marriage between consequentialism and policymaking is a horrible one, because policymakers look for quick fixes time and time again in order to benefit the greater good. I'll reread the quote that I read earlier. Nicholas Reed says the calling problem causes populations is generally an ineffective practice that only makes irritating situations worse, while granting the government the appearance of doing something. That's why the call has to happen again and again, because governments and policymakers think it's a good idea because it makes people believe that something's getting done, even though it has to be done again and future actions are continue to be needed. Why don't we look for a solution that actually works? To that end, the one alternative that I have not heard a response to is why not reintroduce predators in order to be able to have the full ecological balance that we've had in the past. So that way there could be a way where it could be managed. In addition, when we utilize consequentialism in order to be able to determine how we relate to the environment, we're willing to put the environment before the rights of any individual, because any individual that's doing something counter to the environment could be put down for fear that it might hurt the greater good. And this is what we're seeing in terms of the deer call. And lastly, I'd like to point out, in Long Island it hasn't worked, in Rochester it hasn't worked, in Ithaca it hasn't worked, in Vassar it hasn't worked. When I searched the internet, I could not find empirical examples of where a deer call has been able to successfully keep a population down, or where the sharpshooters who promise to be accurate have succeeded in their work. It's not that the biology department or people like that are saying that we want to inhumanely kill deer. These sharpshooters are misrepresenting their skills and what they can and cannot do. Most of the ones, like the ones on Long Island, were ex-military people who are now looking for an excuse to be able to go out there and kill innocent individuals, in this case, deer. We should not rely on that, and I will use the term militarization, in order to be able to protect the environment. Because if environmental protection gets connected with killing and militarism, it destroys the natural beauty of the environment because it becomes something to police through death. Thank you.
Well, first it's been argued that we shouldn't sort of tamper with nature because we should accept nature as it is now. We shouldn't try to put, we don't know what we want in nature. Well, I think we do. Basically, nature has been blasted to hell by people.
Yeah.
We're struggling to save 10% of the surface of the earth, more or less, as intact nature. Sure, we belong in nature, but not anymore. Actually, we're kind of outside. Unless you want to say that the 90% of the world that exists today is a new nature, well, I suppose it is, but it's either agriculture or forested or mined or urbanized. There's very little in natural nature. And we've done all that. So if we try to just rectify a little bit with a little local deer cull, I see that as a step in the right direction. We're not going to correct the whole situation. A little bit on the militarism. One thing I didn't say, which didn't come up, but we almost did this cull 3 years ago. We were stopped by a lawsuit by a neighbor who said it was dangerous to him. The judge strangely didn't even address that issue. She just said, oh, we had to do an environmental analysis, which actually the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, said we were exempt from. So, point is, we almost carried this off, but it was denied, and now the present president we biologists, and I think I can say that generally, are very wary of tampering with nature. We know lots of cases where we've screwed up. But I think, you know, when we carefully consider a case, we can do positive things, and we have done positive things. On the issue of militarism, actually the outfit that we were going to get in 3 years ago is actually run by a biologist, a PhD biologist, wildlife conservationist. So it's not really a military operation. I would just argue that a cull will do what we want in the short term, and then maybe we'll have to think about what to do in the longer term. Maybe we can at least begin to get some regeneration of our forests and natural environment with the deer cull. Thank you.
All right. Let's give our speakers another round of applause. Presumably at this stage, we're going to open it up to the audience for questions and comments. I will, moderate here. Let's start with Dick. Let's see. I could queue some folks up. I think that could work. So keep your hands up. Let's go with you and you and then you. All right. So go ahead.
All right. I would like to ask those that oppose the deer culling if they have any idea what's going to happen in the long run with the deer populations at the level we're at. If they have any idea at all what's going to happen to these campus forest ecosystems in the long run.
Well,
Any idea at all? And I'm serious about this because I thought about this a lot. Some of the rest of us have talked about it. That's why we want to do this.
The first thing, just the nature of debate, just as a preface.
So we're not supposed to ask that kind of question.
No, we switch sides. So when I came in a week ago, I thought I was going to be taking that side.
Okay,
So just as a preface, but to answer your question, I don't know. No.
okay. Well, that's kind of important.
well,
You want me to tell you?
the science that I quoted says that the deer population, as they starve,
Right.
will produce to the levels of availability. So when you kill them, they rebound. Whereas if they continue,
That's coming from. What will happen is that there will be no reproduction of any trees forever. Because the deer will always be present at a high enough level to eat every single seed.
so if there's
So in 100 years, we're going to have a field at best.
wouldn't that then limit the population of deer?
Yeah, but the forest will be gone.
If I could ask,
Yes.
there are forests elsewhere, and wouldn't there be unique opportunities for living for wildlife in this open field?
Sure. There'll be some wildlife in them, but there'll be no forest. The forest, that browse line tells you that forest is dying. It's only a matter of time before the forest is gone. So the question is, where is your priority? Is your priority with the land, the ecosystem, or is it with one animal?
I mean, I think that accurately pinpoints the heart of the debate is whether it's like,
So if you don't want a single deer killed, then you're kissing the forest goodbye, you're kissing all the birds in it, you're kissing everything else in that forest goodbye. That's all I'm saying.
The marsh, hasn't the nature of the way the marsh is and what it's habitable for changed as the water level changed? But we haven't tried to stop the water level from changing.
What's that got to do with the dying forest?
Because the
I don't
dying
get-
forest is the birth of a new,
New
new
what?
environment.
It'll be one we've never seen before on the planet. It'll be a bunch of weeds.
Have there been
You're
other
gonna have-
deer overpopulations?
This is new. This is absolutely new. There have been situations in the British Isles where deer populations that have almost completely prevented any regeneration of forests. Okay? When they plant a tree in the British Isles, they have to protect every single tree with a plastic sleeve or fence. because the deer will eat it. But the abundance of deer right now is a unique historical event. We're trying to respond to something we've never had to deal with before. And so it's a challenge. But those of us that looked at this have decided that the important thing is to preserve the ecosystem. Read Aldo Leopold's The Land Ethic. Aldo Leopold does not say save animals at all costs in the ecosystem. He says you start with the land and save that. And that's what we're talking about here. It is a unique historical. There is no parallel to it in time. It's happening in Japan. It's happening other places, but not historically. There's no history whatsoever of predators being totally wiped out and ungulates taking over the system. This is new. So we're trying to scramble. The fact that the culling isn't perfect, we're trying to invent a whole new thing. And it's getting better. It's getting better. But it's not perfect.
Well, I have two questions. The first question is, I was wondering if you had any empirical examples where deer culling has worked. And then the second question that I have is, why do you believe that the trees and the forests are more important than the individuals that live in the forest? And why would like predator reintroduction be a better solution?
First of all, I don't want to make fun of you, but predator reintroduction is a non-starter. You're going to get a pack of wolves to live out here. You're going to bring in mountain lions.
I've seen coyotes take part.
But coyotes don't
take
take-
apart deer right
but
up
they
there.
don't take
I've
it-
seen them doing it
Sure,
right up
they,
there.
they may take a carcass, they may take a young one, but they're totally
This was a big
ineffectual.
one. They took a big one that I saw.
Okay, but they're not going to do enough of a job at all. They never have. You got to have. There's only two predators that do it: wolves and mountain lions. And there's no way in hell you ever get wolves and mountain lions within 200 miles.
Coyotes do it. I've seen a coyote do it.
Well,
Yeah, coyotes are actually pretty common around here now. They're obviously not controlling the deer
they're not
population.
doing much of anything. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but that's a complete non-starter. Those animals that are capable of killing deer will not live in this populated area, and people will not tolerate them either. The first puma that goes into the stair track and eats little Fifi, that's the end of that, right? I mean, seriously. I mean, I've heard this, I don't know, 100 times. Why don't we reintroduce president? Because
Can
you
other
can't.
people ask questions too? Or,
Yeah,
I think she was second. Right? Am I right about that? Okay, go ahead.
And apologies if this is also a bit of a long comment. Just to introduce myself first, I'm Rafael Schwartz, and I'm a Science, Technology, and Society student at Vassar, where there have actually been 3 deer culls in the past 5 years, which I'll speak to in a second. And as a science student, I have taken part in parallel studies to what has occurred here with the fenced-in enclosures and the measuring of biodiversity. So just a few comments. The first one, because the issue of Lyme disease wasn't fully addressed, and I know that that's often kind of a public health concern. There has actually been in the past year, I believe January 2014, a study put out by a member of the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies in New York State, saying that the correlation between increased Lyme disease and increased deer population is actually a false correlation, and that it's actually a decrease in fox population that leads to an increase in Lyme disease, because decreased fox populations mean increased rodent populations. So just to dispel that, because there are studies that show that that is not as clear of a correlation as many claim. I also just want to mention, because it again didn't come up, the issue of bringing guns onto a college campus. I'm surprised that that wasn't raised here, because I would think that would be fairly controversial given the issues with school shootings and the fact that many people who engage in violent shootings of humans have guns because of their involvement in shooting of other animals. Also, just to speak to what has occurred at Vassar College, and this might not be so publicly known because the school's website actually has tailored the data since the second culling so that the few years prior to the first culling are no longer visible on their bar graph. But prior to the first shooting, the deer population was actually at a stable number and did obviously see a dramatic decrease with the first shooting, but actually rose to above its pre-shooting number because of this campus, which is why Vassar ended up having a second and then a third shooting and intends to shoot every other year indefinitely because of that continued effect. Now just to raise a few other things, I'm wondering what metric was used in order to determine the ideal deer population for Binghamton, because there have been a variety of studies all purporting different deer population numbers per square mile. Also, I'm wondering about confounding variables with the fence study, because again, as a biology student, had to write a lab report discussing how fencing in an enclosure not only bars deer from entering that enclosure, but bars any other number of animals, and also can trap many plant matter, a lot of plant matter, because there's a fence in place. So just to say that a fence doesn't necessarily mean, and the results of that study involving the fence doesn't necessarily mean that it was the deer who were leading to a decrease in biodiversity, but that a fence increases biodiversity. Also with this, just a question of the educational intent of the preserve. Is it an experimental space? If it's an experimental space, wouldn't Binghamton be interested in being a part of this new wave of attempted contraception or any sort of kind of ecological study as a school, as an institution of higher learning, rather than kind of tweaking the environment with what has been a several century long failed method of population control. And then one final question, because I'm not familiar with the property here. How large is the preserve that we're talking about, and do the deer have a range beyond the property? And if so, what has given the faculty of Binghamton the right to determine that the deer should be shot when if the deer do extend beyond the property of the school? So those are my comments and questions. Thank you.
Can I speak to a few of those? First of all, the faculty haven't been given the ability to shoot the deer. That's the major point. Just a little bit about the science that I know. And you mentioned sort of that deer are not, that Lyme disease is not proportional to deer. That's correct. But there's qualifications. It turns out that there's several studies in isolated environments where it has been worked. Turns out that if it's a larger expanse, it doesn't work so well. But deer are they do distribute the ticks. They actually are not vectors for the disease, but they do distribute the ticks, which do contain the disease, and therefore they obviously are a part of the picture, even just a priori without even measuring there. Another thing I'd just say is that you said there isn't any idea of sort of an ideal deer population. Actually, there is in the literature more or less 15 to 30 per square mile is considered a sustainable population, and that's been arrived at by quite a few studies. Obviously, it varies with the environment, with the type of environment as well. But we certainly know that we're way beyond that any of those sort of guideline levels for sustainable deer populations.
And just a quick plug, if anyone is interested, tomorrow at 9 a.m. as part of this conference, I'll be talking about the masculinist history of conservation that leads to the deer killings that we see today.
So before I'm on question, or comment, does anyone want to say anything in response to the question that were asked here? No?
Just one thing also, I'm actually going to have to go soon, so if anyone happens to have any questions that are particularly addressing something that I had said, if you want to go first, otherwise.
Actually, I do have something directly about
Okay.
consequentialism and
Okay,
environmental.
let's we'll have you ask your question.
Okay, I just want to know how you would respond to those who would point out that if we have a consequentialist moral framework for making decisions about public policy, how do we deal with the issue that there are no individual rights? So for example, if we just want to figure out the best way to manage my organs, well, I could save a lot of lives if you shot me in the head and I felt no pain, I didn't suffer, but you distributed my organs. But would we say that that's just, even though it has a mass great effect?
Yeah, well, that's where firstly I'd say that, like, the type of consequentialism that we would be one that does consider those kinds of concerns where the effect on your life is still a consequence, and an element of rights could be incorporated into that consequentialism. For example, a further consequence of that would be that it wouldn't only be you that would happen to, that there would be other individuals who would potentially be targeted or whatever for the supposed benefits, and that a consequence would be that, for example, certain types of populations would get affected. Perhaps we'd say, oh, disabled people or whatever should be targeted because they have less utility or whatever, but then we'd consider the way in which that is inherently ableist, and that is a consequence that I would say should be included within that type of consequentialism. So that's just my personal take on it. I think that status quo consequentialism definitely has the issues of sometimes we don't calculate the consequences very well, and that's an issue that should be considered.
In fact, my question was relating to the same question, but before going there, I just want to talk about your analogy about the trolley problem. First, the analogy with the deer calling and the trolley problem is completely misleading, because this is not a burning out situation where if you do nothing, like both person will die and you can only save one of them. It's not the case, because 90% of the deer population will not die if you do nothing. If they did, you would not have to shoot them. So you need to accept that it's not 90%, so less will die. So some, yes, will starve, but the population eventually will find a way to regulate, maybe because it will not be anything else. But you pretend to adopt an utilitarian framework, but this is just not true, a consequentialist or utilitarian framework, because the cost-benefit analysis, in order to be utilitarian, must be impartial. At the heart of utilitarianism is that one counts for one, and not for more than one. And this is the case for all sentient beings in the utilitarian framework. So if you really adopted this, then you must accept the calling of the human population. But you presented this as a necessary step, but you said, okay, this is not something great, but it's a necessary step. So you kind of presented this as a necessary evil. But I would oppose the use of necessary that you use, the concept of necessity that you use, because the fact that an action is necessary in order to achieve a goal, even a worthy goal, doesn't make this action ethically justified. I mean, the only way to save my daughter might be to kill the daughters of someone else. And even if it's a good thing, a worthy goal to want to save my daughter's life, it's not ethically justified to kill
But the reason
someone
it's
else.
not ethically justified is because of the consequences on an individual. That is within the framework of considering consequences. That the consequence of trying to save one life, if the consequence is taking another life, we would say that that's problematic.
So you
Where to
agree,
address the first issue that you brought up.
So for your trolley problem, you would actually agree that that you said that we must kill one person in order
I just might,
to save four.
what I'm curious is why you think that why plant life doesn't have any value. Like, that's an ethical concern. Those are living beings, and in fact, plants do have sort of a sense of being able to feel pain, that biologically they react to bad things happening to them. So in that sense, I think the idea that it's like, oh, because the animal kingdom is sort of superior to the rest of the world.
No, it's not the animal thing. I'm
But
not.
see, that's that type of consequentialism where you say that it's sentient beings are the only things where consequences matter. I'd say that there are consequences upon what you would consider non-sentient beings to still be a consequence.
In fact, I would use the term, mostly I would prefer to not use the term sentient beings, but mostly vulnerable selves, because I think that in the framework of human rights, we do accept that the reason why each one of us should not be killed or held captive or be tortured, it's not because we are rational or because we have some form of complex personhood, but because each of us is a self who actually cares about his life and the life of others around us. And I think that for many animals, not all the animal kingdom, but for many animals, at least mammals and birds and reptiles, this is the case for them too, and they should be allowed to be protected.
My only problem with that is I feel like that easily gets deployed as an argument for why certain people make claims of certain populations not supposed to be getting about their lives. things like when we see certain populations acting what we believe to be irrationally, that we say, oh, they don't actually care about themselves, and it forces us to sort of make a judgment of whether, you know, does a tree care about its life, and I think that they do. Maybe you think that they don't. I think to some degree, based on the behavior of plant life, that they behave to reproduce, they behave to live. That based on that behavior, I mean, who are we to say that they don't? Like, that's the same type of thing where people do claim that the deers don't care about it.
Okay, so that would,
you know?
that would bring me to the other point. If we care so much about saving the forest around here, if we really care so much about this, then why don't we address the real issue? I mean, the real reason for the loss of biodiversity in the first cause of deforestation around the world is human activity and mainly animal agriculture. So
And
if
exactly
we
why
actually care about it,
directly
we must
you-
all go vegan and change our way of living.
I think that would be acceptable. But,
Any other questions from Ineo in particular?
We have about, let's see, 35 minutes?
Okay, I'm gonna be brief. but
Are you speaking to Ineo's question? Because were you the third
I-
person? You were.
I was one of the ones that raised the hand
Okay.
and said I had
Who
a
was
question.
after? Who was
There were
after you?
four of us.
Okay, just to be fair, you had your chance.
Four
Were you
of us.
next? Were you after?
No, I was.
You were.
Okay.
In that case, you should go. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I just had a bunch of things, and I'm just here as a listener. And I agree with her though, because the person who just spoke, because it seemed that all the speakers started out with, we have to do something. And it was a surprise. And I also felt that Professor Shepard seemed a little suspiciously unprepared, because he said, well, they did it at Vassar, but he didn't say how and how it turned out. And he said, oh, they did it at Ithaca, but he didn't even say what did they do at Ithaca. And I'm glad that this gentleman had looked up on the internet to see how it turned out at Vassar, and we have another witness about what happened at Vassar. But as far as Lyme disease being a threat here on this campus, I heard Professor Stenger in a conversation with this biology professor. I was there, or President Stenger said there's absolutely no threat of Lyme disease on this campus. The downside,
Singer doesn't know. If he
well,
said
he
that.
gets good information as well. And, you know, if the sharpshooters are so great with their guns, why would they just shoot the ticks? And if there are Lyme disease cases here, and we have a health clinic on campus, how many cases have there been? Has it been in the local press? Where are they? Are they here as witnesses saying I had Lyme disease?
There's been a big rise in Lyme disease in Broome County in the last 3 years.
Well, I'd like to see the witnesses on this campus who had Lyme disease right here on this campus. And what do you mean?
I've had it.
Oh, well, I have more things. Because I'm here just as a listener, like I said, but what do you mean delete 90% of the deer? Nobody has said how many deer are there out there and how many deer would be deleted. And I know 3 professors whose property borders the nature preserve. I just talked to one the other day. He walks up there all the time at dusk. He's lived there for 40 years, has not seen an increase in the deer. And the professors that border the campus, their properties, they live there, they walk there all the time. They have not said anything about the increase in the deer, and I know them personally.
We have numbers.
Okay.
So what are
And
they?
even those Canada wildflowers, how beautiful they were in that picture, they came right back when they were enclosed in the fence. You said that the next year they came right back. Why do we have to do something? Why is everyone assuming we have to do something? Is it because we're scientists? Is it because we're sharpshooters? Do we want the Cull named after us? The Shepherd Cull? Let's see. Let's see a published study in a respected international journal saying that the forest here is being permanently damaged. That's all I have.
If you'd like to write down an email address, I can actually forward you some of the sources that I sent.
Okay.
That sparked two ideas. One, whether this happens or not is kind of removed from this ethics debate or what science can be proven and is caught up in bureaucracy. So what you would hear an administrator say about the issue may be very far removed from the realities of what's happening. And like stemming from that, I think if we're going to have a productive conversation, there has to be a certain respect for the science being done. So if we want to question the ethics or philosophy behind science, that's one thing. But to challenge the assertions being made, for the most part, I think yeah, saying like I think we have to take at face value the Lyme disease happening or some of the claims of the damage that is objectively viewed. It's hard to have a hard conversation if we refuse to engage with the science that trained scientists are doing.
Well, I just haven't seen anything in the paper, I haven't seen anything in the piping.
I think one of the big
So really,
issues,
that's not science.
yeah, this is just my opinion, I think one of the big issues is that journalism generally doesn't seem to take much of an issue in either science or also like sort of social justice issues. In the paper, we haven't even seen anything about the animal ethics side of it
Okay, and
either.
when you're saying the reality of what's happening, I don't know if anyone was here last winter, but we had a very difficult winter. And if anyone walked around the nature preserve during the winter or after the winter, it's really not. I've been walking there for years, and I haven't seen as many deer during this winter. And now I've been there at dusk. I know their habits, how they go around, especially when the students are gone away for winter break. There really were not that many deer that I saw at all. In fact, I wrote to Professor Shepard about it, and he said he'd asked this steward, who, is the ranger there, to check into it, but I haven't heard back. Seems to me a lot of the deer have disappeared early on. Nature perhaps is taking its course because we've had a very difficult winter. I did see one deer who had frozen to death.
I can address that if you want. Okay, number one, in the wintertime, especially when you have deep snow, the deer do what's called yarding. And most of our deer are yarded up in one patch of our woods. In fact, the woods that we were pointing out. We had about 35 deer in about 33 acres. The deer.
35 deer, 35 deer and 33 acres?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So each one had
there's
an acre?
125 deer within our borders right now. There's another 136
Did you say
deer.
135?
There's 100.
I'm sorry.
There's 125 deer that use our borders right now.
125?
There's another 136 that come in from the borders. The reason we didn't have any starvation this winter is because we had a mass year of acorns, and they were able to survive the whole winter just on those acorns.
Yes,
So
I
you're not
saw
going to see
the
deer
doing
all over the
acres,
place
yeah.
unless you go to where the acorns are to see how they would. So that's going to explain why.
No, there are acorns all over those hills, and the professor who lives close by was showing me how the deer were eating the acorns, but he said they do that every year.
Not quite every year.
Okay, so you're
The
saying,
acorns don't mass every year.
so you're saying the numbers in the nature preserve are 135 deer
Yes.
in 35 acres, or,
No.
No.
no, 135.
We have
500.
So
we have 600 acres of land.
we can actually hear you that well, actually. But I mean, what maybe summarize for everyone, like what you just said, what the deer are doing in the winter.
Well, on campus we have 600 acres of natural land. CIW is one of the focus points of the deer overpopulation. It's about 33 acres. During the winter, one of the reasons you will not see deer all the time is because they are yarding up. They are throwing it and they're concentrating in certain places where the food is. So this winter, with such high, great depths of snow, they all moved into CIW woods. So that's how many herds that moved into there. Normally, if you have a mild winter, they're distributed all around campus.
Okay. Are there any other comments you'd like to make? I'll give the floor. Otherwise, we should probably move on. We have about 30 minutes.
Oh, there's so much I can say.
There's so much more that you could say. Would you like to say anything else?
Basically, many of the arguments against culling are fundamentally irrational. And to say that it's okay for wolves and pumas to kill animals and for starvation to kill animals, but people cannot kill animals is irrational. It's illogical.
Okay.
I'd like to know how many acres holding this deer population you're talking about? What is the size of this so-called forest?
Yeah.
What is the acreage?
She had the same question.
Does anybody have an answer?
What are you asking?
The issue is-
How many acres in this forest where the deer are roaming? How many acres do you have?
The campus itself is a little bit over 1,000 acres.
So are they roaming all over the campus?
Between 200 and 300 are developed, and the deer are in the rest of it. If you take the numbers of deer that we have, that Joan has mentioned,
What's the numbers of the deer?
it's over 100, about 135. We have approximately, plus or minus, 100 deer per square mile. That's Guinness Book material.
Now, how is it 100 per square mile?
100 per square mile is 10 times what it should be for the forest to regenerate.
And the forest that you're counting for regeneration is how many acres is that?
Just what I said.
800 acres?
700 probably.
Yeah, he said there's 600 acres of undeveloped land. There's 125 deer that are here permanently, and then about another 136 that are moving in and out. That's the numbers that
I mean, we might quibble about hundreds of acres, depending on what you count as part of the reserve, but it's up in the high 700s, plus or minus, someplace in there. The number of deer we know, we have an aerial flight, infrared photography, that had between the campus and the surrounding suburbs had what, 250, something like that deer.
Yeah.
Yeah, 135 would know for yeah, all the deer within the area, 250.
It's outlandish, it's far beyond anything.
So then if you destroy 90% of them,
Right.
what are you down to?
About 10 per square mile.
How many deer will be left? If you're saying 200 deer, let's say.
30.
30 deer, you'll be down to 30 deer for like 600 acres.
Right.
And then how many sharpshooters do you need to do that and for how long?
How many what?
How many sharpshooters will you need for how long of a
A
period?
couple for a couple nights.
Two for 2 nights?
We're only gonna have one over a 2-week period for them.
Right. One guy will do most of it, and has PhD in wildlife biology. He makes his living running a consulting firm that deals with overpopulation problems.
And then what do you do with the meat?
It goes to a butcher and gets distributed to food pantries.
We had that whole plan
It
there.
was all planned out, everything was all set up. That's exactly what we're
And then
gonna
what
do.
about this young lady, when she says at Vassar, when they did the second culling, they went over the amount of the population that they had previously. So what about that? Do you know about that?
No, I didn't know the
We
numbers.
don't know.
You don't know that, so that's something that needs to be investigated, because if you're going to cull one year and then all of a sudden they rebound and go higher than the previous year.
They can't go higher. Take out 90%, they can't reproduce that fast.
But they did.
They do. She can go and then I'll follow
Here's a
her.
response to
Yeah.
President.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and again, the studies, I can try to make them available to you, but the science faculty at my school has very selective in what they put forth, because I think it is embarrassing that the deer did reproduce at such a rate that did rise above the initial numbers. But just to comment on a few of the things here, because I know I kind of listed off a bunch of things when I spoke earlier, and so I'm not going to respond to all of it, but it's understandable. But
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
yeah, sorry, my apologies. Again, I'm just kind of wondering about the educational purpose of the preserve and why some sort of experimental new population control method is not being explored here. It didn't come up during the debate, but there are actually places within this very state that are trying out experimental immunocontraception. Again, several locations throughout the state that have decided after mass public opposition to going that they would experiment, and so there seems to be very dedicated science faculty here who are invested in the preserve and I'm sure engaged in research why that's not an option being explored here. And also, just since it has just been mentioned that it was the intent for the bodies of the deer to be donated to local food pantries, one of the major issues with that that has come up time and time again when my school has engaged in these killings is the human safety concerns associated with the consumption of the deer flesh, because the deer, and I'm assuming it's a similar setup here, have been feeding on pesticide-treated lawns, have all of that in their systems, and also the materials in the bullets can spread throughout the bodies at a very, very minuscule level, to the extent that actually prisons in the state have rejected donated deer bodies because they thought it was unfit for human consumption. And there have been several soup kitchens throughout the country that have, upon further inspection, determined that it's unfit. So just to, before that kind of whitewashing of the killings is put forth, just to say there are issues inherent in that too. But I'd love to hear from the science faculty here why it has been ruled out that you would not engage in kind of the new wave of population control methods that are being experimented with elsewhere. Especially given that culling has been ruled out for the time being.
I can say one or two things. I'm not very knowledgeable about fertility control, but it is expensive. And I know most of you just say, well, cost doesn't matter, but it does. Cornell was able to do it because they have a vet school which donated a lot of time and equipment to it.
Just to comment, sorry, I'm talking specifically about the immunocontraception rather than sterilization or surgical sterilization, which, to my understanding, involves a very, very similar process to the sharpshooting, where it involves similar baiting, and then instead of the lethal shooting, it would involve basically darts that have a 2-year-long hormonal effect on the deer that actually does not make it so that the deer would be unfit for human consumption should someone then consume it because it's
Well, I
unfortunately
haven't heard
unfit.
of darting. There was a darting technique that worked. Does anyone else know about that?
That's
They're
what I'm thinking.
they're doing it in parts of Ontario, Canada as well, and it's been effective.
I couldn't hear it.
They're also doing it in parts of Ontario, Canada, and it's been effective.
Thank you.
Is your question related to this? Okay, in that case. Moving next.
I just wanted to talk about Cornell. I just had to study up. So Cornell did a 7-year study. In the first 5 years, they used a combination of sterilization techniques and hunting, and they could not get the herds down to a sustainable level. In the last 2 years, they switched to archery over bait, and archery over bait and trapping euthanasia. And they got their numbers down way below what they did with contraception. And they said, even just out of the executive summary, they said even with a 90% sterilization of dose, the herd was not, they couldn't get the numbers down low enough, and they suggested that lethal action was taken.
Okay.
Suggested what was this?
Lethal action was taken.
And you said how many years was this?
7 years.
And what's the lifespan of the deer?
I don't know if one of these professors would probably answer that for you.
Because it seems like that study was shorter than the lifespan of a deer, and so if you're engaging in deer birth control, you'd have to see that play out over a few generations. And given that it was stated earlier that this has been a population that kind of reached, it sounds like a similar level to where it's at currently in the 1980s, it doesn't seem like this is an issue that has suddenly reached such a kind of crucial juncture. And so a several generation long experimental study seems like it could have a more successful effect than a 6 or 7 year long one at Cornell.
I would like to see the same standards for a culling experiment. It's been said that culls don't work.
Hunting has been employed for centuries.
Hunting is different than culling. In fact, that's one of the main problems with hunting that we've been advocating is that the numbers don't go low enough. And that's kind of what we've been advocating as opposed to hunting.
And which again, at my university saw the immediate rebound effect so that it was above the level where it was 3 years prior.
Well, what were the steps taken between culls to keep numbers down?
I think I'm gonna call this actually, sorry.
Could you just speak, let's speak louder? I think.
Okay, yeah, so it's really important that you're having a conversation with the entire audience, or all of us, as opposed to just the person that you're responding to. Yeah, that's really important. That's why we're having like a public debate about it, after all, right? So, we have about 20 minutes, and I think that you're next, so, do you want to open up for a new topic? Or?
Well, it's kind of on the same lines. I'm from Ontario, Canada, and they're doing this type of thing in my area as well. They've also said that there's an overpopulation of deer. So to say that this is I think you said what was it, the world record of deer in one area true because in my area we have 150 acres of land and they claim over 200 deer. So, which is an inaccurate number, but regardless, in the last 3 years they've killed over 100 deer in our area, and just this last report that they came out, they said that the numbers have more than doubled. So if this is apparently a cull that's supposed to work in so many ways to get rid of this deer population, they're seriously failing to do so. Also, a lot of them, you are now seeing deer having twins, as you mentioned earlier. You're seeing more mothers with twins compared to a mother with a single born. Also, this idea of sharpshooters is inaccurate. The ones in our area were supposed to have a 5% wounding rate. It was more than 50%, to the point that neighboring homeowners were seen finding dead deer in their backyard, and I sat with one while it bled out in my backyard until somebody came and shot it in the head in front of me. So this is not something that you can say is a humane thing to do, because it's just not possible.
I'm curious about, like you said that you had I guess, I mean, it's a question that follows up on that, directed towards the biology professors who are working with the sharpshooter that you have in mind. Where has the sharpshooter engaged in successful deer calls that have prevented populations from rebounding anywhere else, and has empirical evidence shown that he has been able to do it in what you all are saying is a human way? Or is it just sort of like his consulting firm says that he can do it without that empirical evidence?
There's actually no argument that culling does not need to be repeated.
Okay,
And if you brought in wolves, would they kill a bunch of deer and stop killing them forever? I mean, you have to keep managing the population. And unfortunately, management is imperative because we influence everything. So we have to manage. I mean, people think it as a nature preserve that we just let nature take its course. But I manage pretty much every acre. There's something that has to be done, whether it's removing invasive species, whether it's trying to stop people from vandalizing, whether it's, anything out there. So the argument that, culling is ineffective because you have to repeat it, no one argues against that. No one who is for culling is going to tell you, oh yeah, we just want to cull once and then never do it again. It has to be done again. I mean, that's just because in a situation, the population is going to go back up. And wolves and pumas and predators and humans, if we want active predators, we have to repeat killing. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate that that's the case, but right now, that's the only way to save. If you're talking about ecology, saving the ecology of the forest, that's the only way to do it. If your goal is to reduce, car collisions in the urban environment, then in some places, yeah, they've been trying to use contraceptives, but it doesn't reduce the population of culling.
Just a quick comment about these sharpshooters. First of all, this is not an old thing. We haven't been doing this for a long time. This is a relatively new thing. People are still learning, and some people are much better at it than others. There have been some really poorly organized things involving former Marines coming out that didn't know what the hell they were doing. White Buffalo knows what they're doing. I heard a story about the sharpshooter for them who shot 87 bullets, killed 86 deer, and couldn't find the 87th shell. He had 86 shell casings, couldn't find the 87th one, and was annoyed. That's how good this guy is. This is what a real sharpshooter does. He calls it euthanasia. 4 deer in 4 seconds. This isn't a bunch of cockamamie ex-Marines that are going out there and calling themselves sharpshooters. This is a professional wildlife biologist who makes his living doing a very clean job. So don't mix apples and oranges up here.
Well, I mean, that's why I was asking about the specific sharpshooter that you
Yeah,
speaking
well,
about.
that's the guy we like.
Okay.
I have to go both of those points. The first one would be, this is pretty much forever dangerous stuff. And the second being the nature of how we're killing them. Do big supporters of the deer cull, do you think you could do this? If someone gave you the gun, do you think you could
Hell
shoot
no.
70 deer in the head?
No.
not in terms of the ability to aim at the point, in terms of like ethic. Could you face the dead body in front of you of 60 of a pile of 60
In
bucks?
one half heartbeat.
Because often I think an issue is like a distancing where we can sit in science 3 and talk about it and not look at truckloads of dead corpses.
That was a requirement of me agreeing to do this type of thing. I was going to be there and I was going to participate in it. So it was dragging bodies or whatever, because I did not want it to be a bunch of cowboys out there, you know, shooting all over the place.
I think that's important.
Part of this every step of the way, and I'm very skeptical. And they convinced me of that. And I already, you know.
All right.
You said earlier, you said that arguments against calling a deer were irrational. I would like to address this question because we got caught up in the question if it was useful or not more. But now you are actually attacking the ethical argument, saying that they are irrational. But I would just like to point out that I think that arguing that humans are not the managers of other than human animals, and that that we should change our own behaviors in order to protect forests and biodiversity and stop repeatedly shooting these individuals. I don't see this position as being irrational. It's the opposite. It's based on the best science that we have that tells us that these animals have a psychological and social life of their own. And arguments, and on the other side, arguments in favor of shooting these vulnerable cells just because we see ourselves as the managers of the animals. This position seems to me to rely on very old theological assumption of human supremacy and human dominion. So I see your position as being irrational, your ethical position, not the other one. And just before, I just want to address the question because you talked about euthanasia. I just want to mention that we should really take care of the word we use because euthanasia is actually a really ethical dilemma within human care ethics. It's very important. We are thinking about maybe legalizing euthanasia in Canada. And when we are talking about euthanasia, we are talking about killing someone for their own benefit, his or her own benefit, because there is no other way and they are too much suffering. But it must be done in the interest of the individual themselves. You cannot use euthanasia for your calling. I mean, you don't want to stretch an important moral concept like that.
When I say it's irrational, I'm not talking about value arguments. I'm talking about if people are going to argue that it's okay to let them starve, and it's okay to let the forest be destroyed, it's okay to let other animals die because of that, it's okay to let other animals go extinct because of that, that it's okay to let the deer starve, it's okay to let predators kill them. It's irrational to say that humans can't kill animals.
You're not the managers of the lives of all the other animals.
That's irrational to say that we cannot kill an animal if everything else can kill them. If you're going to argue, I've heard the argument that we should be part of nature, we separate ourselves from nature. If we're part of nature, humans kill animals.
So you're for calling human beings to
So
the
in that
population of
respect,
human
I'm
beings
saying
is
it's
the problem.
irrational. In that respect, I'm saying it's irrational. If everything else can kill animals, why can't human beings kill animals?
What if I said deer are killing lots of species of plants? They're also driving out lots of other species of animals. The deer are doing that.
Yeah, what about us?
Yeah, what about us?
Yeah, we have a call of ourselves.
Oh, yeah, I can't approach that issue, I'm not good at that, but are you gonna just let the deer do all this to our environment? I mean, is that all right?
No,
Now, how much of the land is actually destroyed by the deer? How much of your acreage? You have 135 deer that reside here. How much of all this preserve? First you say forest, then you say preserve, then you say the whole campus. How much is the preserve actually, and how much of the land has now been damaged according to your estimation? With all this deer that's been roaming around for how many years?
It varies from one part of campus to another. It's particularly intense actually right around campus on the lower areas. It's less so higher up.
Would it be half of the damage?
Well, I don't think you can, they're having an impact everywhere. It's less in some places, more in others. You can't say absolutely there's no impact here and lots of impact there, right? Does that make sense? By the way, just one thing to sort of get the unit straight. 600 acres is roughly a square mile, okay? So we said, oh, there's 135 deer on 600 acres, so that's 135 per square mile. And I was saying, oh, 15 to 30 deer is sustainable per square mile. So that gives you some idea of where our tenfold figure comes from.
We have about 10 minutes, and we have 4 people with hands up, so I think we should probably actually give Janelle a chance, because the others have had their chance.
As a matter of fact, I think they should, because I came late, but my question was, I guess it could be a question.
Go ahead.
It might have been discussed prior to me getting here. What steps have been taken besides Cullen to combat the harms that deer suffer on campus or around campus, in the preserve, in the surrounding areas?
Sure.
So no steps have been taken to combat the damage being done, but
How are
by.
you gonna do it? You gotta get the administration like you do. Administration won't let us do anything.
So could the problem be that there haven't, other options haven't been explored? Like could that be,
All right.
are there other options to be explored?
I'm gonna answer this one. Cornell has an extremely intense, extremely extensive program figuring out how to control deer populations with everything under the sun. They've got money, they've got a vet school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They have tried everything under the sun. They continue to explore. To say, why don't we do the same thing, doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It does not make any sense at all. You know, we don't. Yeah. So.
Because it seems like, okay, what it seems like is that it seems like kind of like a cop-out, right? Like they have all this stuff, and just because it hasn't even been explored, like that hasn't been a conversation. Maybe not doing the same things they're doing, because granted we don't have the money or the resources they have, but because it hasn't even been explored, like okay, we can do it this way, or we can do it, look at some other ways. Maybe there should be research or experiment, like maybe we should be looking at other ways to kind of control the damages that are being done. I want to let the question go to someone else now.
I think that's a very fair question and a very important one. But it does turn out that it has been explored fairly thoroughly. It's like you can't reinvent the wheel on everything, right? We learn from the past, we learn from what other folks have done elsewhere.
Yeah.
And there was a committee that looked into this some years ago, and they tried to step by step look through each of the possibilities. And it just doesn't seem that anything else can work. And that was an important part of our discussion before you came, I think. But that has been considered pretty carefully.
And apologies for dominating. I'll try to stop talking after this. But just to respond to a few direct things that have been stated, you talked about White Buffalo as the organization that you were intending to use for the shootings here. And I would just like to point out that Vassar actually, after the first killing, decided not to use White Buffalo because of the public relations issues associated with White Buffalo after a really horrendous video came out of one of their shootings in which it showed several deer struggling for several minutes. And so it was actually determined by our school that they were too much of a public relations issue. And so kind of the reputability of that organization is very much in question if they were even decided to be dropped. Also, I'm kind of concerned that you aren't able to identify the specific areas of the property that have been affected by this. And if there are specific areas, and it sounds like you were saying possibly along the borders of the campus, why specific and strategic fencing hasn't been explored. So again, I believe that the fence study shows that fencing works for increasing biodiversity, but does not necessarily prove that deer decrease biodiversity. So I know that fencing has continually been an option that has been raised at Vassar, especially as selective fencing was used after 1,000 saplings were planted, but it has been ruled out with the only explanation being that it would cost too much money, even though double the amount of money has been used on the killings. So I'm wondering why selective fencing that would be up for however many number of years in order to allow for tree regeneration and possibly intentional planting, so that there aren't several species barred from the entire property, but just specific strategic areas, and possibly that fencing could be moved around, and again, that would probably be a lower cost than successive cullings, because as Keith raised earlier, these shootings do have to be repeated, even though you kind of implied earlier that they would not have to be repeated. So just a few points, and again, I will stop talking if you would like to hear me talk more, come hear me tomorrow.
Let's see, so, well, we might have more than a few more minutes. You give your comments.
So, yeah, I just wanted to comment that, I mean, the thing about studies in science, right, is that they're controversial and they're not definitive. To act as though there's been one study about management population that has defined what is actually good for all communities to do is, of course, it's lying, right? It's way more complicated than that. And so it's not, I think everyone can agree, right? We care about preserving nature and we care about having safe space on campus and we don't want people to have Lyme disease. The question is culling the most effective way, the most humane way, the ethical way to achieve those goals? I'm not going to answer that question because I think that's something for this community to decide together, but to say that, well, we've got this study and that's enough, right? Or that, well, you know, those vegetarians, they're just weepy about killing animals. Like, no, it's more complicated than that, right? And the idea that we can just look to biological information or that we can, you know, just look to ethical information, you know, we've got to get past this ideological difference, right? Of, well, we're deep ecologists over here and we're animal rights activists over here, because ultimately we all have to live, right, on this community. We all have to get along and make decisions that we can all agree. We have to be, you know, part of the democratic process. And I think that when we get dogmatic about our commitments, you know, and assume that we know what other people mean when they're talking, for example, that they're irrational, that they don't understand the science, it's just, it doesn't really help, okay? So, like, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an animal liberationist. I don't think we have the right to use animals for anything, really. In the same way that I don't think we have the right to use other humans for things. And I think that what I try to take to the table is that if our commitment is preserving nature, right, in a way that we think is, you know, best, whatever the hell that means, all of those arguments reduce to one thing: humans fucked it up, and if we really cared, we'd be culling the human population, right? And so why, if that's really the commitment, why do we make other species suffer for that? Okay, I'm not advocating culling of anything, but what I'm saying is if that's the one goal and all other ethical concerns go to the wayside, we know what the answer is. So that's why the ethics portion matters, right? That is, why should we make other species who are not responsible for this problem, humans are responsible for it, pay the price, right, for our follies? And we'll say, oh, well, because it's the only way. Well, that's not clear. It's not clear that it's the only way. That's the controversy.
Anyone else want to comment? We have a couple of minutes. Yeah, it's more or less 4:30. Oh, this is going to be the last one.
One overarching comment. About 2/3 of the forests in the northeastern United States are not regenerating. They're not replacing themselves. That's because of one animal.
Humans?
Yep, there it is.
One animal.
You're talking about deer?
Yes. Deer are preventing the regeneration of the majority of our forests. They are not replacing themselves.
Yeah, how many do we cut down every day because we continue to push
I
ourselves
just-
further and further and further into these ecosystems?
That's another issue.
It's the same issue.
All right. I think we're going to call it.
Thank you for all coming. Anyone who's interested, we have in the anthropology room over there, there's hospitality, there's apple, and like stuff like that, so feel free to help yourself. And this conference is going on for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and it was like the day I went through, when I went back, it was like practice things.
Yeah, oh my God.
Yeah, I was like that already. I was talking with the one lady, the tall lady.
Yeah, Marcy.
Yeah, so, you know, we're maybe doing it because I am for science.